History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 3, Crumbling Certainties. In the 1970s, the two giants still dominated the world as they had done since 1945, and they still often talked as if the world was divided into their adherents or enemies. But changes had come about in the way they were regarded. Some believed the United States to have lost its once overwhelming military preponderance over the Soviet Union, and perhaps any preponderance at all. The perception was wrong, but many, and even some Americans, shared it. Those easily frightened by signs of instability wondered what would happen if another confrontation arose. Others thought that a more even balance might make such a crisis unlikely. Other relevant changes, too, were difficult to weigh up. The two once more or less disciplined blocs, surrounded by a small fry in danger of being swallowed by them, were showing signs of strain. New quarrels were beginning to cut across old ideological divisions. More interesting still, there were signs that new aspirants to the role of superpower might be emerging. Some people even began to talk about an era of détente. Once again, the roots of change go back some way, and there are no sharp dividing lines between phases. The death of Stalin, for instance, could hardly have been without effect, although it brought no obvious immediate change in Russian policy, and even more difficulty in interpreting it. Subsequent changes of personnel led after nearly 2 years to the emergence of Nikita Khrushchev as the dominant figure in the Soviet government and the retirement in 1956 of Molotov, Stalin's old henchman and veteran of the Cold War diplomacy, from his post as foreign minister. There had then followed a sensational speech by Khrushchev at a secret session of the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. In it, he denounced the misdeeds of the Stalin era and declared coexistence now to be the goal of Russian foreign policy. The speech was soon given wide publicity, which shook the monolithic front communism had hitherto presented to the world, and for the first time alienated many communist sympathizers in the Western countries who had been hitherto untroubled by Soviet realities. Or perhaps the revelations allowed them to express an alienation they already felt at no cost to their consciences together with announcement of Soviet reductions in armaments. Khrushchev's speech might have heralded a new mood in international affairs had not the atmosphere in 1956 quickly been fouled. The Swiss adventure called forth Soviet threats to Great Britain and France. Moscow was not going to risk Arab goodwill by failing to show support for Egypt. But the same year had also brought more anti Soviet rioting in Poland and a revolution in Hungary. Soviet policy had always been morbidly sensitive to signs of deviation or dissatisfaction among its satellites. In 1948, Soviet advisors had been recalled from Yugoslavia, which was then expelled from the Commonwealth. Yugoslavia's treaties with the USSR and other communist states were denounced, and 5 years of vitriolic attacks on Titoism began. Not until 1957 did the two governments finally came to an understanding when the USSR climbed down and symbolically resumed its aid to Tito. Yugoslavia's damaging and embarrassing survival as a socialist state outside the Warsaw Pact, however, had made Moscow even more sensitive to tremors in the eastern camp, like anti Soviet riots in East Berlin in 1953. Those in Poland in the summer of 1956 showed that patriotism inflamed by economic discontent could still challenge communism in places nearer to the heartland. Similar forces also helped to explain how disturbances in Budapest in October 1956 grew into a nationwide movement that led to the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the city, a new Hungarian government promising free elections, and the end of one party rule. When that government also announced its withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, declared Hungary's neutrality, and asked the United Nations to take up the Hungarian question, the Soviet army returned. Thousands fled the country, and the Hungarian Revolution was crushed. The United Nations General Assembly twice condemned the intervention, but to no avail. This episode hardened attitudes on both sides. The Soviet leadership could again reflect on how little they were liked by the peoples of Eastern Europe, and therefore became an even more distrustful of Western talk of liberating them. Western European nations were again reminded of the real face of Soviet power and sought to consolidate their growing strength. The last Cold War crisis. In October 1957, Sputnik I had opened the age of superpower competition in space and gave a terrible shock to American confidence that Soviet technology lagged behind American. Soviet foreign policy in the Khrushchev's era, meanwhile, continued to show recalcitrance, uncooperativeness, and sometimes remarkable confidence. Fearing the danger of a rearmed West Germany, the Soviet leaders were anxious to strengthen their satellite, the German Democratic Republic. The all too visible success and prosperity of West Berlin, surrounded by GDR territory, was embarrassing. The city's internal boundaries between West and East were easily crossed, and well being and freedom drew more and more East Germans, especially skilled workers, to the West. In 1958, the USSR denounced the arrangements under which Berlin had been run for the last 10 years and said the Soviet sector of the city would be handed over to the GDR if better arrangements could not be found. 2 years of drawn out wrangling followed. As an atmosphere of crisis over Berlin deepened, the outflow of refugees through Berlin shot up. The numbers of East Germans crossing the West were 140,000 in 1959, 200,000 in 1960. When more than 100,000 did so in the first 6 months of 1961, in August that year, East German authorities suddenly put up a wall, soon reinforced by landmines and barbed wire, to cut off Berlin's Soviet sector from the Western sectors. Tension increased in the short run, but in the long term, the Berlin Wall may have calmed things down. Its gloomy presence and the sporadic killing of East Germans who tried to cross it was to be, for a quarter century, a gift to the Western Cold War propaganda. The GDR had succeeded in stopping immigration, though. Khrushchev quietly dropped more extreme demands when it was clear that the United States was not prepared to give way over the legal status of Berlin, even at the risk of war. A similar rhythm was seen the following year over Cuba, although the risk was then far greater. The European allies of the United States were not so directly interested as they had been over a possible change in the German settlement, nor did the Russians seem to pay much attention to Cuba's interests. Moreover, in a virtually pure confrontation of the superpowers, the Soviet Union appeared to have been forced to give way. While avoiding action or language which might have been dangerously provocative, and while leaving a simple route of retreat open to his opponent by confining his demands to essentials, President Kennedy nonetheless made no conspicuous concessions, though the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey followed quietly after a little while. Immediately, Khrushchev had to be satisfied with an undertaking that the United States would not invade Cuba. It is difficult to believe that this was not a major turning point. The prospect of nuclear war as the ultimate price of geographical extension of the Cold War had been faced by the Soviet Union and found unacceptable. The subsequent setting up of the direct telephone communication between the heads of two states, the hotline, recognized that the danger of conflict through misunderstanding made necessary some more intimate connection than the ordinary channels of diplomacy. It was also clear that, in spite of Soviet boasting to the contrary, American preponderance in armed strength was as great as ever. The new weapon that mattered for purposes of direct conflict between two superpowers was the intercontinental rocket missile. At the end of 1962, the Americans had superiority in this weapon of more than 6 to 1 over the Russians, who set to work to reduce this disparity. The choice was made of rockets before butter, and once again, the Soviet consumer was to bear the burden. Meanwhile, the Cuban confrontation had helped to achieve the first agreement between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union on the restriction of testing nuclear weapons in space, the atmosphere, or underwater. Disarmament would still be pursued without success for many years, but this was the first positive outcome of any negotiations about nuclear weapons. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from office. As the head of both government and party since 1958, it seems likely that his personal contribution to Soviet history had been to provide a great shaking up that had meant qualified de-Stalinization, a huge failure over agriculture, and a change in the emphasis of the armed services towards the strategic rocket services that became their elite arm. Khrushchev's own initiatives in foreign policy, besides the disastrous Cuban adventure, may have been the fundamental cause of the decision to remove him. Yet, though with the connivance of the army, he was set aside by colleagues whom he had offended and alarmed. He was not killed, sent to prison, or even to run a power station in Mongolia. Evidently, the Soviet Union was civilizing its techniques of political change. The contrast with old times was striking. Soviet society had indeed relaxed a little after Stalin's death. The speech at the 20th Congress could never be unsaid, even if much of it was aimed at diverting criticism from those who, like Khrushchev himself, had been participants in the crimes of which Stalin was accused. Symbolically, body had been removed from Lenin's tomb, the national shrine. In the next few years, there was what some called a thaw. Marginally greater freedom of expression was allowed to writers and artists, while the regime appeared briefly to be a little more concerned about its appearance in the eyes of the world over such matters as its treatment of Jews. But this was personal and sporadic. Liberalization depended on who had Khrushchev's ear. It seems clear only after Stalin's death, particularly during the era of Khrushchev's ascendancy. The party had re emerged as a much more independent factor in Russian life. The authoritarian nature of the Russian government, though, seemed unchanged, which is much what might have been expected. The illusion of convergence. It may now seem odd that for a time it was the fashionable thing to say that the United States and Soviet Russia were growing more and more alike, and that this meant that Soviet policy was becoming less menacing. This theory of convergence gave a distorted emphasis to one indisputable truth: the Soviet Union was a developed economy. In the 1960s, Some on the European left still thought socialism a plausible road to modernization because of that. But often overlooked was the fact that the Soviet economy was also inefficient and distorted. Although Soviet industrial strength had long been evident in heavy manufacture, the private consumer in the Soviet Union remained poor by comparison with his American counterpart, and would have been even more visibly so but for a costly system of subsidies. Russian agriculture, which had once fed the cities of Central Europe and paid for the industrialization of the Tsarist era, was a continuing failure. Paradoxically, the Soviet Union often had to buy American grain. The official Soviet Communist Party program of 1961 proposed that by 1970, the USSR would outstrip the United States in industrial output. That did not happen. Although President Kennedy's proposal of the same year to put a man on the moon was realized. Yet the USSR, in comparison with undeveloped countries, was undoubtedly rich, in spite of the obvious disparity between them as consumer societies. To the poor, the USA and USSR sometimes looked much the same. Many Soviet citizens, too, were more aware of the contrast between their stricken and improvised country in the 1940s and its condition in the 1960s than the comparison with the United States. Nor was the contrast of the two systems always one sided. Soviet investment in education, for example, may have achieved literacy rates as good as, and even at times better than, the American. Some comparisons, which fall easily over the line from quantitative to qualitative judgment, nevertheless do not alter the basic fact that the per capita GDP of the Soviet Union in the 1970s still lagged far behind that of the United States. If its citizens had at last been given old age pensions in 1956, nearly half a century after the British people, they also had to put up with health services falling further and further behind those available in the West. There had been a long legacy of backwardness and disruption to eliminate. Only in 1952 had real wages in Russia even got back to their 1928 level. The theory of convergence was always too optimistic and too simplistic. Nonetheless, by 1970, the USSR had a scientific and industrial base that, in scale and at its best, could rival the achievements of the United States. Its most obvious expression and a great source of patriotic pride to the Soviet citizen was in space. By 1980, there was so much ironmongery in orbit that it was difficult to recapture the startling impression made 20 years before by the first Soviet satellites. Although American successes had speedily followed, Soviet space achievements remained of the first rank. Reports of space exploration fed the patriotic imagination and rewarded patience with other aspects of daily life in the USSR. It is not too much to say that for some Soviet citizens, their space technology justified the revolution. The USSR was shown by it to be able to do almost anything another nation could, and much that only one other could, and perhaps one or two things which, for a while, no other could. Mother Russia was modernized at last. Whether this meant that she was in some sense becoming a satisfied nation with leaders more confident and less suspicious of the outside world and less prone to disturb the international scene is an entirely different matter. Soviet responses to Chinese resurgence did not seem to show that. There was talk of a preemptive nuclear attack on the Chinese border. Soviet society was beginning to show new signs of internal strain as well by 1970. Dissent and criticism, particularly of restraints upon intellectual freedom, had become obvious for the first time in the 1960s, as had such symptoms of antisocial behavior as hooliganism, corruption, and alcoholism. But they probably held both as much as little potential for significant change as in other large countries. Less obvious facts may turn out to have been more important in the long run. In the 1970s, native Russian speakers for the first time became a minority in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the regime was still one where the limits of freedom and the basic privileges of the individuals were defined in practice by an apparatus backed up by administrative decisions and political prisons. The difference between life in the Soviet Union and the United States or any Western European nation could still be reckoned by such yardsticks as her enormous expenditure on jamming foreign broadcasting. For obvious reasons, changes in the United States were more easily observed than those in the USSR, but this did not always make it easier to discern fundamentals. Of the sheer growth of American power, there can be no doubt, nor of its importance to the world. In the middle of the 1950s, the United States contained about 6% of the world's population and produced more than half of the world's manufactured goods. By the year 2000, the economy of the state of California alone could be the fifth largest in the world. In 1968, the American population passed the 200 million mark. In 1900, it had been 76 million, only 1 in 20 of whom were not native born. Though within 10 years there would be worries about a huge Spanish speaking immigration from Mexico and the Caribbean. Numbers of births went up while the birth rate dropped after 1960. The United States was unique among major developed countries in this respect. More Americans than ever lived in the cities or their suburbs, and the likelihood that they would die of some form of malignancy had trebled since 1900. This paradoxically was a sure sign of improvement in public health because it showed a growing mastery of other diseases. The immensely successful American industrial structure was dominated in 1970 by a large corporation, some of them already commanding resources and wealth greater than those of some nations. Concern was often expressed for the interest of the public and the consumer, given the weight in the economy of these giants. But no doubts existed about the economy's ability to create wealth and power, though it was to be shown that it could not do everything that might be asked of it. American industrial strength was the great constant of the post war world and underpinned the huge military potential upon which the conduct of American foreign policy inevitably rested. Political mythology still mattered in the 1950s. President Truman's second administration and those of President Eisenhower were marked by noisy debate and much shadow boxing about the danger of governmental interference with the economy. It was largely beside the point. Ever since 1945, the federal government was held and indeed increased its importance as the first consumer of the American economy. Government spending had been the primary economic stimulant, and to increase it had been the goal of hundreds of interest groups and thousands of capitalists. Hopes of balanced budgets and cheap, business like administration always ran aground upon this fact. What was more, the United States was a democracy, whatever the doctrine objections to it, and however much rhetoric might be devoted to attacking it. A welfare state slowly advanced because voters wanted it that way. These facts gradually made the old ideal of total free enterprise, unchecked and uninvaded by the influence of government, unreal. They also helped to prolong the Democratic coalition. The Republican presidents who were elected in 1952 and 1968 on each occasion benefited from war weariness, but neither could persuade Americans that they should elect Republican Congresses. On the other hand, signs of strains were to be seen within the Democratic bloc even before 1960. Eisenhower appealed to many Southerner voters, and by 1970, something a little more like a national conservative party had appeared under the Republican banner because some Southerners had been offended by Democratic legislation on behalf of the blacks. The Democratic voting Solid South created by the Civil War had disappeared as a political constant. Presidents could sometimes shift emphasis. The Eisenhower years leave an impression that little happened in the domestic history of the United States during them. It was not part of that president's vision of his office that he should provide a strong policy lead at home. Partly because of this, Kennedy's election by a narrow margin of the popular vote in 1960, the arrival of a new man, and a young one too, produced a sense of striking change. It was misleading in that too much was made at the time of the more superficial aspects of this. In retrospect, though, it can be agreed that in both foreign and domestic affairs, the 8 years of renewed democratic rule from 1961 brought great change to the United States, though not in the way in which Kennedy or his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, hoped when they took office. One issue already apparent in the 1960s was what could still then be called the Negro question. A century after emancipation, the black American was likely to be poorer, more often on relief, more often unemployed, less well housed, and less healthy than the white American. 40 years later, this was still to be true. In the 1950s and 1960s, though there was growing optimism about changing things, the position of blacks in the American society suddenly began to appear intolerable and became a great political question because of three new facts. One was black migration that had turned a southern question into a national problem. Between 1940 and 1960, the black population of northern states almost trebled in a movement not reversed until the 1990s. New York became the state with the biggest black population of the Union. This not only brought blacks into view in new places, but also in new ways. It revealed that the problem facing them was not only one of legal rights, but was more complex. It was one of economic and cultural deprivation too. The second fact pushing the question forward onto the national stage lay outside the United States. Many of the new nations, which were becoming a majority at the UN, were nations of colored peoples. It was an embarrassment of which communist propaganda always made good use. For the United States to display at home so flagrant a contravention of the ideals she espoused abroad, as was provided by the plight of the many blacks. Finally, the action of blacks themselves under their own leaders, some inspired by Gandhian principles of passive resistance to oppression, won over many whites. In the end, the legal and political position of black Americans was radically altered for the better as a result. Yet, bitterness and resentment were not eliminated in the process, but in some places actually increased. The first and most successful phase of the campaign for equal status for the black was a struggle for civil rights, of which the most important were the unhindered exercise of franchise, always formally, though not actually available in some southern states, and for equality of treatment in other ways, such as access to public facilities and schooling. The success stemmed from decisions of the Supreme Court in 1954 and 1955. The process thus began not with legislation but with judicial interpretation. These important first decisions declared that the segregation of different races within the public school system was unconstitutional and that where it existed should be brought to an end within a reasonable time. This challenged the social system in many southern states, but by 1963, there were some black and white children attending public schools together in every state of the Union, even if others stayed in all black or all white schools.